Welcome to Dark Screen Chronicles, where the lights go out and the stories come to life. Tonight we're venturing deep into the woods, where the trees whisper secrets, and the darkness hides more than just shadows. Camping is supposed to be about escaping reality. But what happens when something follows you into the wilderness? When the crackling fire isn't enough to keep the horrors at bay? These are the stories that will make you think twice before zipping up that tent. So sit back, turn off the lights, and whatever you do, don't look behind you. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Jake, Lila, and Marcus had done this plenty of times before. Pack some gear, hike deep into the woods, set up camp, and tell ghost stories around the fire. But this time, something felt off. They had picked a remote spot, farther than usual, deep in the forest where no cell signal reached. The trees were unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that wrapped around them like a thick fog. As the sun set and the fire crackled, Marcus started a ghost story. But halfway through, Lila shushed him. "Did you hear that?" Silence. Then, crunch. A footstep. They froze. The sound came from the darkness beyond their campfire's glow. "Probably a deer," Jake whispered, though he didn't believe it. Then came another sound, a low, wheezing breath. Marcus grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the trees. The beam swept through the woods, landing on something. A man. Or at least what looked like one. He stood unnaturally still, his face obscured by shadow, his clothes ragged. But his eyes, they reflected the light like an animal's. "Hello?" Jake called, his voice unsteady. The man didn't move, didn't blink. And then, in the most unnatural motion, his head tilted, too far to one side like a broken doll. Lila gasped, "We need to leave." They doused the fire and shoved everything into their bags, moving fast. But when they turned to head back toward the trail, he was closer. They hadn't heard him move. Panic surged. They ran, crashing through the trees. The path twisted in the darkness, the moon their only guide. Behind them they heard something, not footsteps, but a scraping sound, like something dragging against the forest floor. Then came a whisper. Not from behind them. From ahead. "You're going the wrong way," Lila shrieked. Marcus tripped. Jake yanked him up, and they sprinted blindly. Suddenly, the woods opened up. They stumbled onto the trailhead where their car was parked. Whipping around, they expected to see him standing at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing. Just the silent, still forest. Shaking, they piled into the car, sped off, and never looked back. The next day, Jake checked the area on a map. There was no record of a campsite where they had stayed, no trails leading that deep into the woods. And when he looked at the photos he had taken on his phone earlier that evening, in the background of their campfire picture, just beyond the trees, stood a tall, dark figure watching them. Mark and his younger brother Danny had always loved camping. Their parents took them every summer, setting up their tent by a quiet, secluded lake deep in the woods. But this summer was different. Their parents were gone for the weekend, so Mark, now 18, decided they could handle the trip alone. They set up camp, built a fire, and cooked hot dogs under the stars. The woods were peaceful, the lake still as glass, but then, just as the fire burned low, a sound drifted through the trees. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A slow, deliberate tune. 3 notes, repeated soft but unmistakable. Danny looked up. "Did you hear that?" Mark forced a chuckle. Probably just the wind. But the sound came again, closer. 3 slow notes, whistled perfectly as if someone were right behind them. Mark grabbed the flashlight and shined it into the woods. The beam caught the gnarled trees, but nothing else. "Hello?" he called. Silence. Danny shivered. "Maybe we should go in the tent." Mark nodded, locking the car just in case. They zipped themselves inside, listening. The woods were still. Maybe it was nothing. Then, a long, slow exhale right outside the tent. Danny clapped a hand over his mouth. Mark held his breath. The zipper started to move. Mark lunged for the flashlight and shined it through the fabric of the tent. A shadow stood right outside, tall, still. Then, the whistling. 3 notes. The figure didn't move. Mark grabbed Danny's arm and whispered, "On 3, we run to the car." Danny nodded, tears in his eyes. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, the entire tent collapsed on top of them. Screaming, they fought their way out, kicking and clawing at the fabric. Mark stumbled to his feet and shined the flashlight wildly. No one was there, but the whistling started again. This time, from the other side of the lake. They jumped into the car, peeling out of the campsite, watching in the mirror as their tent lay in ruins. When they got home, their parents didn't believe them. But a week later, their dad got curious and went back to the site. The tent was still there, torn apart. But that wasn't the worst part. Near the fire pit, carved into a tree, were 3 words: "See you soon." And beneath it, the first 3 notes of a song. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip. Dan, Lisa, and Mike had camped in these woods a dozen times before. They had their usual routine: set up camp, cook dinner, and tell creepy stories by the fire. But this time something felt different. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed too still. Maybe it was how their footsteps echoed slightly, even on the soft earth. Or maybe it was just the creeping feeling that they weren't as alone as they thought. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Mike grinned and said, "All right, let's play a game." Lisa groaned. "Not another one of your stupid dares." "No, this one's fun," Mike insisted. "You just call out into the woods. Ask a question. If you get an answer, you win." Lisa rolled her eyes. "And what do we win?" Mike smirked. "Bragging rights?" Dan shrugged. "Fine, I'll go first." He turned toward the darkness, cupped his hands around his mouth, and called out, "Is anyone out there?" Silence. Mike laughed. "Lame. Let me try." He stood up and shouted, "What's your name?" Silence. Lisa, ever the skeptic, smirked. "Told you, just another dumb." "Lisa." The voice came from the woods, software, breathy. Close. Lisa's face drained of color. Dan stood up. "Who was that?" No answer. Mike, looking nervous now, forced a chuckle. "Okay, very funny. Who's messing with us?" Silence. Lisa swallowed hard. "Let's go." They packed up fast, throwing everything into their bags. The air felt heavier now, the trees pressing in closer. As they reached the car, Dan dared to take one last look back, and his stomach turned to ice. Just beyond the glow of the dying fire, a shape stood between the trees, tall, unmoving, watching. Dan turned back to the car, shaking. Drive. They didn't stop until they were miles away. That night, Lisa lay awake, staring at her ceiling, trying to convince herself it had been a trick, a weird echo, a prank. Then, from just outside her window, a whisper. "Lisa." Nate and his girlfriend, Emily, had been hiking all day. By the time they found a clearing to set up camp, the sun was already setting. The spot was perfect. flat ground, a small fire pit, and even an old wooden sign nailed to a tree, though the letters had faded with time. They pitched their tent, built a fire, and sat close as the night deepened around them. "This place is kinda creepy," Emily admitted. Nate smirked. "That's the fun of it." But as the fire crackled, something felt off. The woods were too quiet. Not a single chirp, rustle, or crack of a branch. Then, just past the fire's glow, Emily saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. Her breath caught. Nate. He followed her gaze, but by the time he looked, it was gone. "Probably just shadows," he said, though his voice wavered. Emily wasn't convinced, but she didn't argue. They retreated into the tent and zipped it up tight. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Emily squeezed Nate's arm. "Did you hear that? Probably just an animal." But then, a sound from inside the campsite. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling their tent. Nate held his breath. Emily pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Then, the zipper of the tent moved. Someone was outside, tugging at it. Nate bolted upright and shouted, "Hey!" Silence. He grabbed a flashlight and yanked the zipper open. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing, no footprints, no signs of movement. The fire still flickered, casting eerie shadows, but no one was there. That's when Emily gasped. She pointed at the tree where the old wooden sign had been. It wasn't faded anymore. The words had changed. Carved deep into the wood, fresh and jagged, it read, "You aren't supposed to be here." They left everything, tent, backpacks, even their food, and ran. They didn't stop until they reached their car, peeling out of the dirt road, speeding away from whatever had been waiting for them. The next day, Nate told a park ranger what had happened. The man frowned and said, "That's not possible. That campsite's been abandoned for years. Nobody's been there since..." He hesitated. "Since what?" Nate demanded. The ranger sighed. There was an incident, years ago. A group of campers went missing. All they found was a tent and a message carved into a tree. Nate's stomach twisted. What did it say? The ranger's face darkened. "You aren't supposed to be here." Chris, Tyler, and Megan had been planning this camping trip for months. A long weekend deep in the Appalachian wilderness, miles from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just them, a tent, and the wild. The first day was perfect. They hiked, swam in a hidden creek, and cooked over an open fire. But as the sun dipped below the trees, the forest took on a different feeling, too still, too quiet. Tyler was the first to mention it. "Where are the crickets?" Chris frowned. He was right. The usual nighttime chorus, frogs, insects, the distant hoot of an owl, was completely gone. A heavy silence pressed against them. "Maybe a storm's coming," Megan suggested, though the sky was clear. They tried to ignore the unease, retreating into their tent. Hours passed. Sleep came slowly. Then, sometime in the night, a crunch of leaves outside. Chris opened his eyes. The sound was rhythmic. Footsteps, not an animal. Someone was walking around their tent. Chris turned to wake Tyler, but his friend was already sitting up, wide-eyed. "Do you hear that?" Tyler whispered. Then, the breathing. Slow, ragged, too close. Megan clamped a hand over her mouth. Chris's heart pounded. He reached for the flashlight, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped. The breathing stopped. Then a shadow fell over the tent. A shape, tall, motionless, looming. Chris swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he flicked on the flashlight, pointing it toward the thin fabric of the tent. The light revealed a silhouette. A man. But something was wrong. The proportions weren't right. His head was too smooth. Chris whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. Then, the sound of the zipper moving. Tyler bolted upright. "Hey!" he shouted, scrambling for the pocket knife he kept in his pack. Silence. Chris unzipped the tent in one swift motion, flashlight in hand, heart slamming against his ribs. The light cut through the trees. No one was there. The three of them stumbled out, scanning the clearing. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows. Megan's breath hitched. "Look." Her voice was barely a whisper. They turned and saw them. Footprints, leading from the woods, circling their tent, and then disappearing. Not back into the forest, just stopping. Like whoever or whatever had been there had simply vanished. Chris's stomach turned. "We're leaving. Now." They packed up in record time, adrenaline burning away their exhaustion. Within minutes, they were on the trail, flashlights bouncing off the trees as they practically ran back toward the car. That's when Megan stopped short. "Guys," she whispered, pointing. "The trees." Carved into the bark, deep and fresh, were symbols, dozens of them. Strange, jagged markings stretching along the trunks. Some looked almost like faces, or rather, the absence of them. Tyler swore under his breath. "What the hell is this?" Chris took a shaky step closer, scanning the markings, the rough edges of the carvings, the way the symbols seemed to pulse under the light. His throat went dry. They weren't carvings. They were growing. Megan whimpered, backing away. "We need to go." Chris turned, and there he was, standing just off the trail. The man with no face, tall, unmoving, his head smooth, featureless, a blank void where a face should be. The air turned ice cold. Then he tilted his head, not like a person, more like a puppet, his body stiff, the movement unnatural. Chris grabbed Megan's wrist. "Run!" They sprinted. Through the trees, down the trail, lungs burning. Behind them, branches snapped. Footsteps, too fast, too heavy. Tyler tripped. Chris yanked him up, shoving him forward. The car was in sight. And then, the whistling started. 3 notes, slow, hollow. It wasn't coming from behind them. It was coming from ahead, from the car. Chris's stomach twisted. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys, nearly dropping them. They piled in, slammed the doors, locked them. For a moment, silence. Then, just beyond the reach of the headlights, the man with no face stepped out of the woods. He stood motionless, head tilting again, like he was studying them. The whistling faded into the night. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand and waved. Chris floored it. They didn't stop driving until the sun rose. None of them spoke about what happened that night, not to family, not to friends. But weeks later, when Chris went to check his gear, he found something inside his backpack, a single piece of bark. Carved into it, a face. His face. It was supposed to be a relaxing solo trip. Will had been camping alone for years, and he loved the isolation. No phones, no traffic, just him, the trees, and the open sky. This time, he picked a new location, a remote forest by a lake, miles from any main trail. The air was crisp, the water still, and by sundown, a light fog had started to roll in. Will didn't think much of it. He set up camp, built a fire, and let the flames crackle against the creeping mist. By midnight, the fog had thickened into a dense wall. It swallowed the trees, the lake, even the moon. That's when he heard it. A splash. Will frowned. The lake was calm, no wind, no movement. But something had just disturbed the water. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the shore. The beam cut through the fog, revealing only rippling water. Probably a fish, he thought. Then came another sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Like footsteps, but not on the ground. On wood. Will turned, scanning the mist. His canoe was still tied up at the shore, empty. Then, why did it sound like someone was walking on it? He swallowed hard and stepped toward the water, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Hello? Silence. The fog shifted slightly, parting just enough to reveal the canoe. His stomach dropped. Someone was in the canoe. A figure sitting perfectly still. Will's breath hitched. Who's there? No answer. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just sat there facing him. The fog thickened again, swallowing the canoe whole. Will stumbled back toward the fire, heart hammering. Had he really seen that? Then, the footsteps started again. But this time, they were on land, coming toward him. The fire flickered violently. The fog swirled. Shadows moved just beyond its glow. Then came the whispering. You shouldn't have come here. Will bolted for his tent, zipped it shut, and grabbed his hunting knife. He held his breath, listening. Silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The fire outside had burned low, the embers barely glowing. Then, just as sleep threatened to take him, something pressed against the tent. A hand, not pushing, not clawing, just resting, feeling. Will's entire body locked up. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the zipper began to slide down. Will lunged forward, knife in hand, yanking the flap open and slashing wildly. Nothing. No one was there. But his canoe? It was gone. The rope had been cut, the water still rippling where it had once been tied, and on the ground just outside his tent was a single footprint, bare, wet, pointing toward the lake. He didn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, he packed up and hiked out, never looking back. Days later, curiosity got the best of him. He searched old records, trying to find anything about the lake, and he did. A report from 20 years ago. A missing camper. Someone who had taken a canoe out onto the lake alone and vanished into the fog. All they ever found was his boot and a single wet footprint leading out of the water. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. 4 friends, a weekend in the mountains, nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the crackle of a fire. Jason, Mark, Hannah, and Rachel had been camping together for years. They prided themselves on finding places no one else went. Places with no trails, no maps, no signs of life. This time Mark found the spot. A valley deep in the Appalachian woods, a place so remote it wasn't even marked on topographic maps. No cell service, no ranger stations, just the 4 of them and the wild. It took a full day of hiking to get there. By the time they arrived, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. The valley was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. Rachel shivered. I don't like this place. Jason laughed. You say that every time. No, she said, hugging her arms. This is different. Mark, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. It's fine, just quiet. Probably because no one comes here. Hannah nodded, but something about the silence gnawed at her. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the weight of it. Like the entire valley was listening, but they ignored it. They set up their tents, built a fire, and settled in. Then, as the flames flickered, Rachel noticed something. The trees. They weren't normal. The bark was scarred, covered in strange, twisting carvings. Some looked like eyes, others mouths, open and screaming. She nudged Hannah. "Look at this." Hannah ran her fingers over the carvings. "It's like faces," Jason laughed. "Probably just old folk art. You know, those weird wood carvings people make out in the middle of nowhere." Rachel frowned. "They don't look old." And they didn't. The cuts were fresh, the edges sharp. Something was still making them. They went to bed late. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced along the twisted trees. Then, sometime in the night, a noise. Rachel woke first, a low whispering sound. Not words, more like movement. She held her breath, listening. The whispering grew louder. Then, footsteps. Not just one set, dozens. Crunching leaves, moving in circles around their camp. Slow, deliberate. She turned toward Hannah's tent. "Hannah," she whispered, "and wake up." Hannah groaned but stirred. "What?" Crack. A branch snapped. Close. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She unzipped her tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, but the glow was enough to illuminate the clearing. Something was standing at the edge of the trees, tall, unmoving, watching. Rachel's stomach twisted. She tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then, it stepped forward, and another figure stepped out beside it, and another, and another. Dozens of them. Tall, gaunt figures emerging from the trees. Their faces were missing, not hidden, not covered, just gone. Smooth skin stretched over where eyes, a nose, a mouth should be. Rachel choked on a sob. The figures tilted their heads. Then, they opened their mouths, or where their mouths should have been. Their faces split wide, skin peeling back in impossible ways, revealing nothing but black voids, and they screamed, not out loud, inside Rachel's head. Rachel bolted. She ripped through the tent, grabbed Hannah, and screamed, "Run!" Jason and Mark were already awake, terror in their eyes as the figures stepped closer. Then, the fire went out. Darkness swallowed the valley. The only sound was their screaming thoughts inside Rachel's skull. They ran, blind, stumbling, branches clawing at their faces. Jason tripped. Mark yanked him up. "Don't stop!" Behind them, the hollow ones followed. Not running, gliding, moving without sound, without effort. The trees blurred together. Rachel's lungs burned. Then, a structure, a cabin, rotting, ancient, barely standing. But it was shelter. They burst inside, slamming the door, barricading it with their bodies. Silence, then the whispers, inside the cabin. Rachel turned. The walls were covered in the same carvings as the trees. Faces, hundreds of them. Mouths open in silent screams. Jason whimpered, "What the hell is this place?" Then, Hannah screamed. She pointed at the floorboards, a trapdoor. And from beneath it, knocking, slow, steady. Then, a voice. Faint, weak. "Please, help me." Mark paled. "No." Rachel's hands shook. "What if someone's down there?" Jason grabbed her wrist. "If something's down there, it's been down there a long time." The knocking grew louder, desperate. "Please, they're coming." Then, the door behind them creaked. The hollow ones were outside, waiting. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps. No way out. Above them, the attic. Below them, the trap door, and all around them, the hollow ones, closing in. Mark moved first. He grabbed a rusted lantern from a shelf and hurled it at the trap door. The wood splintered, and for the first time they saw, not a person, not a prisoner, bones, hundreds of bones, skulls stacked like trophies. Mark staggered back. Oh, God, then a whisper. Rachel turned. One of the carvings on the wall. It moved, its mouth opened, and a voice came out. You were never supposed to find this place. The hollow ones didn't break in. They didn't have to, because the walls were them. The faces were theirs. And now, they had 4 more to add. They were never found. No bodies, no remains, no sign that anyone had ever been there. But sometimes, campers in those woods report strange things. Whispers in the trees, carvings that appear overnight. And if you listen closely, you can hear knocking beneath the earth, begging to be let out, or worse, to get in. There was a rule in the small town of Harrow's Ridge: never whistle at night. No one really knew where it came from, just an old piece of folklore passed down through generations. And like most superstitions, people brushed it off as nonsense. Until you spent a night in the woods. Charlie, Darren, and Liv didn't think much of it when they arrived. They were city kids, used to bright lights and constant noise. They didn't believe in legends or curses. What did they have to fear in the woods, surrounded by their camping gear and the comforting sounds of crackling fire? They had picked Blackwood Forest specifically for its solitude, a place far enough from the town that they wouldn't be disturbed, but not too remote to be dangerous. Just far enough from the beaten path to get a real escape from everything. As the sun dipped below the trees, they set up camp, shared a few beers, and joked about their urban legends back in the city. Darren pulled out his guitar, and they all sang along, laughing as the fire flickered in the growing dark. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. The air grew heavy, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. The wind that had been rustling the trees earlier now felt still. And though there were plenty of crickets earlier now, there was nothing. No chirping, no rustling. Charlie looked up at the stars, then toward the trees. You guys notice how quiet it is? Darren snorted. You're just hearing things. It's the woods, man. You're not used to this kind of peace. Liv, who'd been quiet, seemed uncomfortable. It's not normal, though. It's like the whole forest is holding its breath. But Charlie dismissed her, grabbing another beer and tossing it toward Darren. The fire crackled. Darren strummed his guitar again. The others tried to enjoy the moment, but an undercurrent of tension pulled at them. Something was off, and then they heard it. At first, it was faint. A soft sound that made them all pause mid-conversation. A faint, melodic whistle. Lee's face went pale. What was that? Charlie laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Probably an owl, or some animal. Who whistles, anyway? But Darren, who had been watching the darkness beyond their firelight, stood up slowly. That's no animal. It's human. He strained his eyes, peering into the dark, beyond the reach of the fire. It was difficult to see. There was no moon tonight, just a dark blanket of sky above them. But he could have sworn he saw something move just outside the light. A shadow that didn't belong. Liv shuddered. Stop. Let's just go to bed. I don't like this. But it was too late. The whistle came again, louder now, clearer. A tune, And then another one farther off in the woods, and another. They were all around them. The air felt colder now, and Liev was visibly shaking. This is wrong. We need to leave. Right now. Charlie's bravado had disappeared. His grip tightened around his beer can, and his voice dropped to a whisper. It sounds like it's coming from the trees. Darren grabbed the flashlight from their pack and shone it toward the source of the whistle. The beam cut through the dark, bouncing off tree trunks, but there was no movement, no sign of anything, just the relentless whistle, and it was getting closer. Suddenly, a dark shape stepped into the light. A man, a tall figure, wrapped in tattered clothes, standing at the edge of the clearing. His face was obscured by a hood, but what struck them was the complete lack of expression. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin where a face should be. And his hands were raised, like he was holding something invisible. Then, he began to whistle. It wasn't the same tune anymore. It was distorted, twisted. Each note felt like it was being pulled from some deep, unnatural place. The figure took a step forward. Another whistle, much closer. And then another figure. A second man, just as tall, just as hollow in the face. And he too began to whistle. Charlie's heart pounded. What the hell are they doing? Liv was backing away, eyes wide with terror. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But it was. The figures slowly advanced, circling the campsite. More of them appeared from the trees, at least 10. Silent, tall, faceless figures, each one whistling the same eerie tune. Darren's voice trembled as he grabbed the others. We need to go. Now they scrambled to pack their things. The whistle grew louder, now a chorus of dissonant notes, surrounding them from every direction. It was too much to think, too much to process. Then, one of the figures reached out. It was fast, too fast, and grabbed Charlie's arm with cold, clammy fingers. He screamed and tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, pulling him toward the figure's featureless face. And then it whispered in his ear. The voice wasn't human. It was like 100 voices, layered on top of each other, each one echoing in his skull. You called us. The others rushed forward, pulling Charlie away, but the figure didn't let go. Liv cried out, pushing the figure away with all her strength. Get off him! Let him go! And that's when the whistling stopped. The figures paused, like they were listening. Then, they took a single, synchronized step backward, and they vanished into the trees. The forest was quiet once more, but not like it had been before. This silence was heavy, pregnant with something that felt wrong. Darren pulled Charlie up. We need to get out of here. Now. Without looking back, they ran. They didn't stop until they were miles away, the trees finally thinning out as they reached the edge of the forest. But the silence still clung to them. The memory of the whistling. The eyes that weren't eyes. The faces without faces. They never spoke about it again. But every year, when they're out camping, when the night is still and the wind is just right, they can still hear the whistle. And sometimes, when they're alone in the dark, they feel a cold hand on their shoulder. And they know they'll never be alone again. Every town has its dark corners, places you're told never to go. For the small town of Miller's Hollow, that place was Pine Hill Woods. No one really talked about why people avoided the woods, but the warnings were there. Don't go after dark. Don't go alone. Kara and Ben were the new kids in town. They had no idea about the legends. They had grown up in the city. where trees were just part of a city park, and the woods were something out of a fairy tale. When they heard about the woods, they thought it was just some local superstition. So one evening, they decided to check it out. How bad can it be? Kara laughed, tossing her bag over her shoulder. Ben smirked. It's just a bunch of trees. If it's really that bad, we'll leave. No big deal. They hiked out toward Pine Hill Woods, unaware that their casual exploration would be the last thing they would ever do in Miller's Hollow. It wasn't until they entered the woods that they began to feel the weight of something wrong. The trees were tall, impossibly tall, their branches twisting above them like fingers reaching for the sky. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper, the canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. There was something about the way the branches moved, like they were alive. Kara felt a chill crawl down her spine. Ben, this place, it's giving me the creeps. Ben laughed it off, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Something had begun to gnaw at him, too. They reached a clearing, the trees forming a near-perfect circle around them. In the center of the clearing was an ancient stone well, moss-covered and cracked, as if it had been there for centuries. Kara bent down, inspecting it. This doesn't look like something people would just leave here. Ben approached the well, his footfalls strangely muffled on the soft ground. It looks like an old ruin, probably some tourist trap. But the moment his hand brushed the stone, a sound echoed from the trees. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible. But it wasn't wind. It was too deliberate, too personal. Kara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Did you hear that? Ben nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the trees. Yeah, that was weird. The whisper came again, this time clearer. Don't go any further. The voice was guttural, like it had been scraped from deep within the earth, as if the forest itself was trying to warn them. Kara's heart hammered in her chest. We should leave, right now. But Ben, feeling a strange pull toward the well, took another step. The whispering voices grew louder, rising in volume, as if 1,000 voices were now murmuring from within the trees. You don't belong here. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. Kara gasped and grabbed Ben's arm. What the hell? Before Ben could respond, the whispers turned into a unified scream. Not just any scream, 1,000 screams. They came from everywhere, from every direction, from the trees, from the earth, from deep within the well. Kara spun around, her eyes wide with panic. We need to run, now! But Ben was frozen, staring at the well. And in the blackness of the well, something stirred. A figure, dark, shifting, like smoke made flesh. It rose from the depths, dragging itself out of the well with unnatural speed. Its face was a blur, its body writhing like it was being pulled from a nightmare. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth, and screamed in a voice that shook the trees. Ben screamed, but it wasn't his voice. It was the forest. And then, as if it had always been waiting, the trees began to move. Not just swaying. They bent inward, their branches creaking and snapping, twisting toward the clearing. Kara grabbed Ben's arm, pulling him back toward the path, but the trees closed in behind them, trapping them in the clearing. The well gurgled, a deep, wet sound that echoed across the forest floor. Then, silence. For a moment, the forest went still. The whispering stopped. The trees held their breath. Kara couldn't even hear Ben's frantic breathing next to her. It was as though the world had gone mute. But in the silence, something else became clear. The well was no longer empty. A figure stood on the edge, its limbs too long, its body too twisted. It was the same one that had risen from the well, but now it was fully formed. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a writhing mass of eyes, mouths, and features that didn't belong together. It stared at them, its many eyes blinking in unison. And then it spoke. "You called us." Kara tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. Her body was frozen, like the very air had thickened around her. She could feel Ben shaking beside her, but she couldn't move. The creature stepped forward, its form melting into the earth as it moved, like it was one with the soil. "You came, and now you'll stay." With that, the trees began to close in faster. They were suffocating them now, the branches like hands grabbing, pulling. But just before they were swallowed by the trees, Kara felt something. The ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell, tumbling through the earth, faster and faster, until she landed with a thud. The whispers had returned, but now they were inside her head. They had been there all along, waiting for her to call them. No one in Miller's Hollow ever spoke of Kara and Ben again. People would still hike near Pine Hill Woods, but they never strayed too far into the trees. The warnings were still passed down. Never whistle at night. No one could ever explain what happened to the two campers. But on quiet, moonless nights, when the wind was still and the trees whispered in unison, if you listened closely enough, you could hear it. A soft whistle, coming from the woods. And in the trees, eyes that weren't eyes, faces that didn't belong, and bodies that had never belonged to anyone. The whispering pines had claimed two more, and they were waiting for anyone foolish enough to call them. On the edge of the mountains, nestled among thick woods, there was a campsite that no one talked about, the old Pine Campground. Nobody ever mentioned it unless they were in the right company, or in the wrong company, depending on how you saw it. Those who had camped there once never spoke of it again. Not out of shame or fear, but because it was a silent agreement, a pact. Never go back. So, when Emily and her friends decided to make the trip, they were doing it for a laugh. They were city kids, used to sleek urban life and the glowing screens of their phones. The idea of roughing it in the woods seemed like an adventure, a weekend away from the noise. They had heard the whispers about the old Pine Campground, but they laughed it off. Old legends. Stupid things people told to scare you away from a good camping spot. When they arrived, the place looked, well, normal. There were the usual signs of decay. Old chipped wood on the picnic tables, the remnants of a fire pit, half buried in leaves. The only odd thing was how silent it was. Emily had grown up near forests, birds, insects, the rustling of the wind. Those were the sounds of nature. But here, it was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just a thick, oppressive silence. "Weird," she murmured as she set down her backpack. "I'll go get firewood," said Mark, one of her friends. His voice was casual, but his eyes kept darting around, uncomfortable with the silence as well. As Mark disappeared into the trees, Emily and the others started setting up camp, trying to ignore the stillness pressing down on them. It wasn't long before Mark returned, looking disheveled. I couldn't find anything," he said, his voice shaky. Emily frowned. "What do you mean, nothing? There's plenty of wood around here. I mean, it's just wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but something's off about this place." They all tried to shake it off. The mood shifted as they started the fire and pulled out their food. They ate quickly, but the uncomfortable silence never left. That night, as they gathered around the fire, Emily noticed something strange. The trees seemed closer. The shadows were deeper. She glanced around, feeling like something was watching them from the edges of the light. "Hey, let's tell ghost stories," said Sarah, another friend trying to lighten the mood. Emily smiled, but there was a nervous edge to it. Sure, why not? How about we make it a little more interesting? We'll tell the worst ghost story we can think of, the creepiest one that comes to mind. They all agreed, and one by one, they began sharing the stories they knew. The tales of haunted houses, restless spirits, and tragic curses that they had heard growing up. But as Emily's turn came, she hesitated. She hadn't thought of anything to share. But when she opened her mouth, the words came out without her thinking. You know, Emily said, her voice suddenly low and serious, there's a story about the old pine campground. It's said that every year, someone disappears here. They leave behind their things, but there's never a sign of struggle. Nothing except for the campfire. Always a campfire. No matter how cold it gets. Even when there's no one left around it. The fire keeps burning. The group laughed nervously, but the laughter was tight, forced. Where did you hear that? Sarah asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Emily shrugged, not even sure herself. She'd heard the story in passing when she was younger. Nothing to take seriously. But the longer she spoke, the more she felt like something was listening. Something beyond the firelight. That's the story, though. That the fire always keeps going. And no matter how much you try to leave, you're always drawn back. The people who disappear, they're never really gone. You see them around the fire sometimes, even after years. Their faces are there, but not quite. Not like they were alive. You just know. Emily trailed off. The fire crackled loudly, but the silence that followed felt suffocating. Her voice had dropped so low, like it wasn't even hers anymore. That's just a story, right? Mark asked, his voice shaky. Before anyone could answer, a loud crack echoed through the woods. Everyone jumped. It came from the direction of the trees, like a large branch snapping, followed by a soft rustling. Then another crack. Mark, his face pale, stood up slowly. I'll check it out. I'll be right back. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the darkness. No one spoke as they watched him go, but they could hear him, just barely. The crackling of twigs, his boots on the underbrush. Then, nothing. Minutes passed. Mark, Emily called out. There was no answer. Mark, she shouted, rising to her feet. But the woods had swallowed his name. It was silent again. Ben stood up, his eyes wide. This isn't funny. Come on, Mark, come back. But Mark didn't return. The woods remained unnervingly quiet, but not in the same way as before. The silence now felt heavy, like the very trees were holding their breath. After another 10 minutes, Emily made the decision. We need to go find him. She took a step toward the darkness, but as she did, she froze. The fire flickered violently. Something was moving around it. Shapes, shadows. Not just shadows of trees, but people. Figures, distorted and wrong. They stood near the fire watching, but they didn't move. They weren't human, at least not fully. There was something in the way they shifted, like they were stuck halfway between the world of the living and the dead. Their faces, if they had faces, were shadowed and distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. Then they turned toward Emily, and they smiled. The grin was wide and unnatural, stretching too far for any normal human mouth. And that's when she realized. These weren't people. These were the missing. The stories had been true. Mark had joined them. They were here, with her, waiting for the last fire to burn out, waiting for the moment she would join them in the silent woods. The fire flickered one last time, and then the forest was silent, and Emily was never seen again. The old pine campground is still there. The fire's always burning for those who disappear, but there's a rule that the missing know now. You never leave. Once you've camped there, once you've heard the whispering from the trees, the fire always calls you back. You can run, but you'll find yourself standing before the campfire once more, and you'll join the others who are forever trapped in that place, an endless circle of whispers, shadows, and fading memories. The pact is sealed, and the fire never dies.